Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Patrick Foster always believed he knew his wife. 12 years together, 8 of them married, seemed enough to decode every gesture, every pause, every shift in tone. But it took a Christmas dinner, surrounded by twinkling lights and cheerful voices, for him to realize just how wrong he'd been. The table was full, the house smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon, and guests laughed loudly as wine made its way around the dishes. Patrick, at 39, felt content on that night of December 25th. He'd built a stable life, worked hard, kept the house in order, and Claire had always seemed happy beside him. At 36, she was the kind of woman everyone admired at family gatherings, polite, attentive, and quietly beautiful in a way that didn't draw excessive attention but never went unnoticed either. The family was gathered as they were every year. Patrick's aging parents sat in the main chairs. His 2 brothers arrived with their families, nieces and nephews running through the living room, and a few cousins who only showed up on special occasions. Among them was Marcus, a distant cousin Patrick saw maybe 2 or 3 times a year. Marcus was 34, single, worked in something tech-related, and had always been cordial but distant. He wasn't close to Patrick, they didn't share confidences or stories. They simply coexisted at family events, exchanging polite greetings before moving on. When it was time for the toast, everyone stood with glasses raised. Patrick offered the toast, speaking about gratitude, family, and hope for the year ahead. Voices blended into a cheerful chorus, and it was exactly at that moment that Patrick noticed it. Claire stood next to Marcus, separated only by an empty chair, and when their glasses clinked during the group toast, she looked away so quickly the motion seemed mechanical, forced. It wasn't dramatic, no knowing smiles or lingering touches. Just that too quick gesture, that avoidance of eye contact lasting less than 2 seconds, yet it burned into Patrick's mind like a stubborn stain. He tried to ignore it. Poured himself more wine, chatted with his brother-in-law about football, helped his mom slice dessert. But the feeling lingered, uncomfortable, like a pebble in his shoe. Half an hour later, when the room had emptied a bit and some guests drifted toward the couch, Patrick grabbed his phone and suggested a photo. "Hey, Claire, take a picture with Marcus over there. We hardly ever get photos with the whole family." It was an innocent, casual request, the kind made at any gathering. Claire stood with her back to him, arranging glasses on the table, and when she turned around, her expression changed. It was subtle, but Patrick saw it. Her eyes widened for a split second, her mouth opened slightly as if to say something but then closed midway. She picked up her own phone from the table, walked stiffly over to Marcus, and stood beside him in an awkward, almost uncomfortable pose. Patrick raised his phone to take the photo, but before he could snap it, Claire's phone slipped from her hands. It landed softly on the carpet, screen face down. She bent down far too quickly, grabbed the device with both hands as if protecting something precious, and said, in a tone trying to sound casual but coming across tense, "Sorry, clumsy me." Patrick forced a smile, took the photo anyway, and put his phone away. Marcus laughed at something someone said across the room and walked off. Claire returned to the kitchen without another word. That night, lying beside his sleeping wife, Patrick stayed awake staring at the ceiling. The scene replayed in his mind in slow motion, the averted glance during the toast, the dropped phone, the excessive urgency to pick it back up. On their own, none of it meant anything at all. Together, they formed a pattern. Patrick wasn't the paranoid type. He'd never snooped through drawers, checked messages, or doubted Claire. But something had shifted that night, and he couldn't quite name what it was. December 26th passed slowly. Claire was quiet, saying she was tired from the dinner and spending most of the day watching shows in the living room. Patrick tried talking, asked if everything was okay, and she answered with an automatic yes, without taking her eyes off the screen. He didn't press further. On the morning of the 27th, while Claire showered, Patrick picked up his phone and opened the shared location app they both used. They'd always used it just to know when the other was coming home. Patrick would alert her when leaving work, Claire would check if he was stuck in traffic. Patrick had never even opened the history tab before. He'd never had a reason. Now, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee in hand, he scrolled through it for the first time. The past 30 days were logged there, each blue dot marking where Claire had been at a specific time. Most were predictable spots: the house, the grocery store, the gym, her mom's place. But there were other addresses too. A downtown apartment appeared 5 times in the past month. Always at odd hours: 2 p.m. on a Thursday, 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, 4 p.m. on a Saturday when Claire had said she was handling paperwork at the bank. Patrick tapped one of the addresses, and the map opened, showing a 3-story, old brick-faced residential building with narrow windows. He didn't know whose place it was. The street didn't ring a bell. He copied the address and pasted it into a search engine. Nothing useful came up, just the confirmed location and some generic Google Street View photos. Patrick took a deep breath, locked his phone, and sat there, listening to the shower turn off upstairs. It was a strange feeling. He didn't have concrete proof of anything yet, just suspicions based on subtle behaviors and a recurring address. Part of him wanted to ignore it all, return to routine, pretend nothing had changed. But another part, larger, more insistent, knew he couldn't. When Claire came downstairs, already dressed and combed, Patrick was seated at the kitchen table. He hadn't planned what to say. The words came out before he could organize them. "Claire, we need to talk." She stopped mid-step, still holding the damp towel in her hand. "About what?" Her voice was neutral, but Patrick noticed the instant defensiveness, the way she crossed her arms over her chest as if shielding herself from something. "About you and Marcus." Silence. Claire didn't answer right away. She looked to the side, out the window, anywhere but at her husband's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Patrick picked up his phone and showed her the screen with the map open, the blue dots marked. "This address here. You went there 5 times last month. Always when you said you were doing something else." Claire looked at the screen, and Patrick saw the exact moment something shifted. She didn't break down immediately, there was resistance, one last attempt to hold the story together. "Patrick, this isn't, you're jumping to conclusions." But her voice faltered at the end of the sentence. Patrick said nothing, just kept looking at her, waiting. The silence stretched, heavy, until Claire looked away and took a deep breath. Okay. I did meet Marcus a few times. But it's not what you're thinking." He stayed quiet. Didn't accuse, didn't yell, just waited. And that's exactly what broke her last defense. Claire pulled out a chair and sat slowly, placing the towel on the table. Her shoulders dropped. "All right, it was more meetings than I should have allowed." She ran a hand through her wet hair, fingers trembling slightly. "Me and Marcus, yeah, we met a few times. But it wasn't planned. It wasn't something I wanted." Patrick felt something cold slide down his spine. "Then explain it. Because the way you're talking sounds exactly like what I'm thinking." She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were moist. "It was stupid. It was wrong. I know that. It started a few weeks ago, after that barbecue at your parents'. We talked. At first it was just small talk, random stuff. He asked how I was, and I don't know, Patrick, I said things I shouldn't have. Told him I sometimes felt lonely, that you were always busy, that we didn't talk the way we used to." Patrick clenched his fists under the table, nails digging into his palms. He remembered that barbecue. Remembered having to work the next day, staying only a short while because of an important Monday morning meeting. Remembered Claire saying she'd stay later and catch a ride home with someone in the family. It never crossed his mind that that seemingly innocent afternoon would be the start of all this. Anger mixed with a sharp pang of guilt began to form in his chest, but he pushed it down. This wasn't the time to take on blame that wasn't his. Claire had made choices, conscious ones. Claire went on, her voice growing softer, almost a whisper. He listened. Said he understood. That he sometimes felt that way too, lonely, you know? We started texting. Nothing much at first, just, I don't know, venting. Daily stuff, complaints about work, about family. It seemed harmless. Seemed like just friendship. She paused, wiped away tears with the back of her hand. But then the messages became more frequent, morning, afternoon, night. And the tone changed. It got more intimate. He started saying things you hadn't said in a long time. That I was beautiful, that he enjoyed talking to me, that he felt good when we spoke. Patrick's stomach churned, but he forced himself to keep listening. He needed to know. Needed to understand the full extent of what had happened, even if every word felt like a blow. And then, he asked, his voice hoarse. Was it still just messages? Claire slowly shook her head. He suggested we meet in person. Just to talk, he said. Grab coffee, vent face to face. I hesitated at first, I swear I did. Knew it wasn't right. But I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. That we were adults, that we could have a friendship without it meaning more than that. So I agreed. Patrick felt anger rising but kept his voice controlled. Each word came out slowly, measured, as if he were holding back a bomb about to explode. And then? Did you talk? Claire shook her head again, eyes fixed on the table, unable to meet his gaze. We did talk. I met him 3 times at that apartment. It belonged to a friend of his who'd traveled out of town for a whole month to care for his mom. The place was empty the entire time, and we used that. The coldness with which she described the planning cut Patrick deeper than he expected. It wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, taken advantage of, thought out. But it wasn't just talking, was it? Patrick asked, though he already knew the answer. Claire closed her eyes, breathing heavily. We didn't go as far as you're thinking, she said, but Patrick noticed the tremor in her voice, and couldn't decide whether to believe her or not. But there were kisses, long hugs, there was intimacy. The kind of intimacy that should have been just ours. The last sentence came out almost like an apology, but Patrick wasn't in a position to offer forgiveness. How many times, he asked, each syllable heavy with pain he didn't want to show but that spilled out anyway. 3, maybe 4 times. I lost count exactly. It was weeks when I was confused, when I didn't know what I was doing. I thought it was just a phase, you know? That it would pass. That it didn't mean anything real. That it was just me trying to fill a void. Patrick exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to shout. Didn't mean anything? He repeated her words with bitter disbelief. You betrayed our marriage, Claire. You went there, met my cousin, behind my back, planned every meeting, lied to me about where you were, and now you sit here and say it didn't mean anything? She lifted her head, tears now flowing openly. Claire took a while to speak. Her hands shook on the table. I didn't plan any of it, Patrick. It just happened. I was confused. Felt alone. I know it's a cliché, but it's true. She paused, wiped her face with the back of her hand. I'm not blaming you. I'm just trying to explain how it happened. But the responsibility is mine. I chose to do this. I made the wrong choice. Patrick said nothing, he didn't need to. The silence did the work. Patrick stood, pushing the chair back harder than he'd meant to. You could have talked to me. Could have said anything. But you chose to go somewhere else. Chose someone else. Claire buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Patrick left the kitchen, went upstairs, and locked himself in the bedroom. He sat there for hours on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall as if it might offer answers. Anger burned in his chest, but there was also a deep sadness he couldn't name. It wasn't just the physical betrayal. It was the broken trust, the realization that the person he'd shared the last 12 years with was capable of building a parallel life and lying straight to his face. He remembered all the times Claire had gone out saying she was heading to the store, to her mom's, to run errands. How many of those times had she actually been meeting Marcus? How many lies had she told with that unsettling ease? Patrick ran a hand over his face, feeling exhaustion weigh on him like a boulder. He couldn't understand how they'd gotten to this point. He tried to spot the signs he should have seen. Claire on her phone more often? Yes, but not alarmingly so. Less interest in deep conversations? Maybe, but Patrick had also been distant. Guilt began creeping in, a voice whispering that maybe he'd failed too. But Patrick firmly pushed that thought away. No. He didn't make Claire cheat. She made conscious, deliberate, repeated choices. If there were problems, there were other ways to handle them: therapy, honest conversations, even separation. Not betrayal. In the days that followed, the house turned into a silent minefield. Claire tried talking a few times, apologized repeatedly, said she was willing to go to therapy, to rebuild. Patrick listened in silence but didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to believe it could be fixed, that this had just been a momentary mistake. But another part, more rational, less emotional, knew something had broken beyond repair. A week after their talk, Patrick made his decision. He called Claire into the living room, where she sat with red-rimmed eyes from days of crying. "I can't keep going like this," he said, his voice firm but weary. "I can't look at you without remembering what happened. I can't trust you again. I've tried, Claire. Tried to process it, tried to understand, but I just can't." She shook her head, lips trembling. "Patrick, please. We can try. I'll do anything." "No," he interrupted. "You already did. And I'm not going to stay here torturing myself, wondering if you're being honest or if it'll happen again. I deserve better than that. We both deserved better than this." Claire didn't argue. Maybe she knew there was nothing left to say. They agreed the separation would be civil, no aggressive lawyers, no fights over property, no public exposure. Patrick didn't want to turn it into a spectacle. He wasn't seeking revenge, just an end. Claire moved in with her sister while she looked for an apartment. Patrick stayed in the house, but the silence was deafening. Every room carried memories that now felt tainted. The family found out gradually, through brief, awkward conversations. Patrick's parents were shocked but respected their son's decision. Marcus disappeared from family events. No one had to say a word for him to understand he was no longer welcome. Claire, meanwhile, faced silent, disapproving glances the few times she showed up to handle practical separation matters. There was no scandal, no public shouting, but the divide was clear. The family took sides, not explicitly, but through absences and telling silences. 3 months later, Patrick sat in the backyard of the new, smaller house he'd rented, big enough just for him. The divorce was underway, bureaucratic but uncomplicated. He'd reconnected with old friends, returned to the gym, and tried rebuilding a routine that didn't revolve around pain. It wasn't full happiness, but it was a fresh start. Claire, from what he'd heard through mutual acquaintances, was living alone, working, trying to move forward too. There were no reports of her and Marcus continuing anything. Whatever had existed between them seemed to have died along with the marriage. Patrick picked up his phone and opened his photo gallery. He scrolled until he found the image from that Christmas night, the rushed photo he'd taken of Claire and Marcus side by side, both with forced smiles, their bodies slightly apart as if afraid closeness would reveal something. He stared at that picture for a long minute, then deleted it, not out of anger, but because it no longer made sense to keep it. What Patrick learned in those months was that betrayals don't always come with dramatic, cinematic revelations. There were no scandalous texts, no explosive public confrontations, no dramatic showdowns. Just two people making poor choices, a suspicion that grew slowly, and a marriage that ended not with a bang, but with a tired sigh. There was something deeply disappointing about that. Patrick had maybe expected some grand justification, a huge reason that explained why everything had fallen apart. But there wasn't one. Just human flaws, unspoken silences, and an intimacy that faded somewhere along the way without either of them noticing until it was too late. He didn't hate Claire. He was surprised to realize that. He felt anger, yes, and hurt, but not hatred. She wasn't a monster. She was just a person who made mistakes, who made selfish decisions during a weak moment. That didn't excuse anything, but it made everything strangely, painfully understandable. Patrick didn't want revenge, he didn't want to see her destroyed. He just wanted to turn the page and move on, to build a life where that pain no longer sat at the center of everything. And Marcus? Patrick never spoke to him again. He didn't need to. His distant cousin became even more distant, practically non-existent. Patrick didn't feel the need to confront him, demand explanations or apologies. What Marcus did was indefensible, but Patrick wasn't interested in carrying that weight. He let Marcus's own absence from family events be punishment enough. Some people commented on his disappearance, but Patrick never went into detail. He'd just say they'd had a disagreement and leave it at that. What bothered Patrick the most, even months later, was how ordinary it all was. In the first days after the discovery, he'd imagined there must be something grand behind the betrayal, a sweeping passion, a forbidden romance full of intensity. But no. It was just Claire feeling lonely and Marcus being convenient. It was the breakdown in communication between him and his wife. It was the routine that had swallowed their marriage without either of them noticing. There were no villains, just imperfect people making mistakes. And that, in some ways, was even harder to process. Patrick started going out again, accepted dinner invitations, met new people. He wasn't looking for a serious relationship, but he wasn't closed off to possibilities either. Life went on, and he was learning to walk with his scars without letting them define who he was. There were bad days, when the memory hit hard and he caught himself questioning every decision he'd made during the marriage, every sign he might have missed earlier. But there were also good days, when he could genuinely laugh at something funny, when he felt he was rebuilding something worthwhile, when he noticed the pain was fading, even if slowly. Claire tried reaching out a few times. Short, polite messages asking how he was, apologizing once more. Patrick replied with distant courtesy, leaving no room for deep conversation. He didn't want to feed resentment, but he also wasn't ready for friendship or any kind of closeness. Maybe someday, years in the future, they could meet somewhere and talk without pain. But that day was still far off. Patrick's new apartment had a small balcony where he could watch the sunset. On Sunday afternoons, he'd sit there with coffee and a book, enjoying a silence that was no longer oppressive but freeing. He thought about how drastically his life had changed in just a few months, and though there was sadness in that reflection, there was also a strange sense of relief. He no longer had to pretend everything was fine. He no longer had to ignore signs, suppress suspicions, or live inside a comfortable lie. The lesson Patrick carried with him was simple and bitter: not all betrayals are spectacular. Sometimes, a marriage unravels through small gestures, averted glances, phones dropped on the floor, repeated addresses in a location app. And what hurts isn't just the betrayal itself, but realizing the person beside you was capable of building a parallel life without you noticing until it's too late. There were no heroes or villains in this story, just two people who failed each other, and a marriage that ended not with an explosion, but with a tired whisper. Patrick took a deep breath, set his coffee aside, and opened his book. Life went on. Wounded, yes. More cautious, definitely. But it went on. And maybe that's what mattered in the end, the ability to keep going even when everything falls apart, to rebuild even when it seems impossible, to accept that not every story has a satisfying ending, but that doesn't mean it's not worth living through to the end. The next Christmas would be different. Patrick knew that. There'd be no dinner in the same house, no Claire beside him, no illusion of a perfect family. But there would be honesty. And maybe, with time, there'd be peace. For now, it was enough just to be alive, to be free, and to be learning to trust again, not others, not yet, but himself. In his ability to survive, to reinvent himself, to look back without getting lost in what might have been. The past was where it belonged, behind him. And the future, uncertain but full of promise, waited ahead with possibilities Patrick was still discovering. And that, in the end, was all he needed to know. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.